Okay, so we're recording. So welcome back, everyone, to the Command to Commerce podcast. And I am delighted to be joined today by a very special guest. So you'll see behind some evidence of what Peter does. So Peter Apps, very celebrated author, journalist and warrior, specialist reservist, and we'll hear more about that. With me, Shell, the Leadership Alchemist, for those of you who've not met me before or are coming to this podcast for the first time. Shell Richards, I am an ex-military now working in business, leadership and consultancy with a focus on serious gaming and decision making. I must declare a prior relationship with Peter. So we worked together in the military, and you might hear a bit more about that. And now very good friends and colleagues out here. And a reminder before we start speaking with Peter, what the Command to Commerce podcast is all about. It's a real privilege to have a platform to really showcase the lives and careers of successful military soldiers, officers, and blue light professionals who have also used those skill sets and experience out here, in service of whether it's UK business, UK national resilience, or in some cases, as Peter is representative of both. So Peter, it's a delight to welcome you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here.
So let's make a start first of all. For the benefit of our listeners, maybe you can just introduce yourself, your sort of what you're doing at the moment, your current sort of role and sort of portfolio, and give us an idea of who is Peter Apps.
That's a really good question. It's to quote the Morecambe and Wise joke, I've done lots of interesting things, but not necessarily in the right order. My background is when I first sort of entered adult life and came to London University, I was a University of London Officer Training Corps officer cadet, and I did a bunch of work experience in the media, and that got me a job as a graduate trainee at Reuters at the age of 22. So that's been my primary employer since. So I've done what is now 23 years with Reuters News Agency, world's largest news agency. I went overseas with them after about 12 months to do really interesting reporting in Southern Africa and Sri Lanka. Some of you can see I'm in a wheelchair now. I wasn't then. I had two glorious years reporting overseas, 2004 to 6 in Southern Africa and Sri Lanka, the latter during the Civil War. And then I broke my neck in a minibus smash on the Eastern Front in Sri Lanka at the age of 25. I was going to say so far so conventional. That's not a particularly conventional career for someone sort of 7 years of adult life anyway. But obviously it became slightly less conventional from there. I had joined Reuters because I wanted to tell interesting stories, do interesting things in interesting places, and lead really good teams of people doing stuff in very challenging environments. And it was fairly clear to me when I broke my neck that that was going to be more challenging. But I was able to reinvent myself within Reuters as one of their sort of big picture analysis writers. And by the time we got to the 2008 financial crisis, the 2009-10 Greek debt zone crisis, Georgia war, the Arab Spring 2011, I was writing lots of analysis pieces for Reuters in basically sort of real time about global events. And I wound up being their global defense correspondent in 2014. So about 12 years ago, at the same time as Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea. And about that time, I wasn't getting to travel as much as I wanted. I didn't find it gave me the sort of the team and the network and the leadership experience that I wanted. So I had a really challenging period of time in 2014. Was on very heavy bed rest. I had some pressure sores. So I was spending 28 days a month in bed, and some occasions there were a couple of months, sort of November of 13 and maybe March of 14, where I got up twice in those months. So really challenging. And I decided when I got myself on the Queen Mary, the ocean liner, got myself across the States, although I was spending most time in bed there as well. And I decided I was going to found a think tank, partly because I just wanted to work with people. So I took on a bunch of interns. So young people, young men and women, students mainly in their sort of early 20s, most of them sort of probably aged about 20 to 23, although some probably a bit younger and a bit older. And we built a thing called the Project for Study of the 21st Century, which was a pop-up think tank, and it's run about 150 plus events ever since. We've done a bit less since COVID, although we still run a podcast with the British Army think tank, the Centre for Historical Analysis and Conflict Research. We still do the occasional conference. And as part of that, or after a year of doing that as a sabbatical from Reuters, I got, much to my surprise, although also slightly down to my own efforts to make sure this happened, I got a tap on the shoulder from the British Army, because they were setting up a number of specialist capabilities at that point, including information operations, cyber, that kind of thing. And I was asked if I would come back as an unpaid junior officer to do some sort of advice and training. And I said yes, but I also made one thing very clear, which was that while I was coming back as an unpaid reservist, which means you're expecting you to do sort of 2 or 3 days a year, what I intended to do was to be useful enough to encourage them to make me a proper reservist. In other words, despite my physical disability, to get to the point that they would pay me and give me substantive rank. So I initially came in with what they call sort of acting honorary rank as a lieutenant. And what I wanted to do was to persuade them to give me substantive rank and promotion prospects and pay. And I managed to achieve that through an incredibly slow-moving process, just in time to get both of those for the start of 2020, at which stage, as most of you remember, the world ended in abrupt hurry. I remember sitting in an operations room as COVID was starting and the entire British Army was coming home and the world was changing very, very fast. And it was fairly clear to me at that point, so we're talking about March of 2020, that by the time the pandemic was over, we would be knee-deep in a new Cold War. It was also, I think, fairly clear to elements of the British government that might be where it was heading, but also that they needed a bunch of extra sort of capabilities, analysis, a bunch of stuff done remotely. So I ended up helping to build and ultimately lead a largely remotely operating analysis team during COVID. And then I did a year running the analysis of that full time as its chief analyst. And then I demobilized for a year, and then I mobilized again after the invasion of Ukraine to do a staff officer job in Ministry of Defense main building. So those are my sort of 2 years of experience doing government stuff, which I never expected to do. I learned a hell of a lot. I was very junior level. We're talking about sort of lieutenant, acting captain, but still really interesting. And I stood down from that in 23, having spent my last sort of mobilization also writing a book, A History of NATO, that you can just see behind me, which I got the contract for just as that mobilization came through. And I've written another book since then called The Next World War, The New Age of Global Conflict and the Fight to Stop It, that came out in January. And essentially, I now divide my time in about 3 or 4 ways. So I write a bi-weekly column for Reuters. I'm back with them as a columnist. I try and do my sort of 20 days a year to keep myself, in as a reservist, doing various things. A lot of that remote, some of it not remote, but I'm still part of that, and I'm still open to going back into that full time should that ever sort of kick off properly. Writing books, I'm just in the process of pitching what I hope will be my 3rd full-length book, and PS3 one still exists, and I'm working out what to do with that and where to take things. I've just started a small private company of my own that allows me to do events and material, and that I'll run that alongside the other things that I'm doing and other things that other opportunities I'm exploring. So that's me at the moment. A very unorthodox life, not the life I'd have chosen, but it has actually been quite interesting. And I feel for someone who has been paralyzed from the shoulders down for the last 20 years and has sometimes been incredibly restricted in what they can do, I've actually managed to get around the world quite a bit, see some interesting things, see some interesting people, and do some interesting stuff.
And it's, thank you. So I guess for listeners who don't know you as well as I do, they're thinking, A, do you ever sleep? And B, how do you keep your energy so high? So I was actually talking to someone about you the other day, Peter, when I was walking for quite a long sort of days worth of walking, reflecting on all sorts of things. And I was saying how much energy you have, and actually, you sort of put me to shame in terms of your social energy as well, because you're doing so much in your working life. But I think there's porosity between your working life and your social life as well, which is kind of keeping that balance. So I was going to ask you, so that I should situate our sort of professional relationship in that final chapter you spoke about, where we both spent Whitehall we spent COVID in Whitehall together, albeit in different roles in different parts of Whitehall. We were working across Whitehall at the same time there, and obviously we interacted when you were a specialist reserve, when I was a sort of relatively naive, newly promoted captain in that specialist reserve world. So maybe we'll talk a bit about that later, but I reminisce about those as good times. Okay, so let's bring us into the year that is 2026. I was just, people will be interested in your views on kind of life in 2026 in London, amongst other things, but also on your professional view on the world we're now in. So what's your review of the year so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I mean, just to pick up on a couple of things you said, I mean, firstly, the journalistic sort of life that I embraced and really loved is one where your social and professional life sort of overlap. So, when I was in the field in somewhere like Johannesburg or Sri Lanka, my friends were journalists and aid workers, diplomats, and people doing really interesting stuff. And those worlds would overlap. I mean, since the injury, I mean, it looks on paper like I've done a lot. Do not understand how many hours there have actually been being locked in a room on my own without the interactions that I wanted. So I've done, yes, I've done those 2 years mobilized, and I have been around a bunch of people and meetings and so forth, but I have had a lot less of the kind of churn that people would anticipate in business or medicine or for that matter conventional journalism, where you've got lots of meetings, lots of things going on, lots of activity. My life has sometimes had that. I mean, certainly during COVID I worked 70 days without a stretch. There have been times where I've been hyper busy, and I rather enjoy that. I have had much less opportunity to be hyper busy in those environments than I would have liked.
Yeah.
There are a variety of reasons for that, and the most obvious is that those opportunities have been much more closed to me than they would have been if I were able-bodied. I mean, I'm very struck by the fact that when I was interviewed at Reuters, one of the people who interviewed me sort of told me afterwards they wrote down leadership potential on my sort of application form. I do not believe anyone has ever written that on a report on me since the injury, even in environments where I have been delivering leadership and effect at a high level.
Yeah.
In fact, going back to the army, without the much more time and paperwork has been expended on explaining to me in emails why I cannot progress down any of those routes, for a variety of reasons around sort of career track and so forth. There's an element to which I would say, and I would say the same is true this year. I've had a book come out this year. I've done some podcasts. I've done some other things. I've traveled quite a bit. I was in Florida for Special Operations Forces Week. I was in Washington, D.C. So I've done some interesting trips and things and so forth. Nevertheless, I would say that quite a lot of this year has not been as active as my sort of profile suggests. There's also a really interesting dynamic. I mean, I keep myself up to date a lot. So I am exceptionally well briefed. There's a review from the Telegraph that describes me as one of the best connected people in defence. And to an extent, that is true, in the sense that there aren't that many people who can suddenly sort of wander up to the Chief of General Staff at the Land Warfare Conference, the big sort of Royal Navy Centre, and go, you just said this, how does this fit into this story I'm writing about how NATO will fight? And CGS will sort of say, who is obviously many ranks above me when I'm in uniform, will sort of say, well, you say, okay, here's what I understand, but I'm going to get my sort of chief of what, cyber or whatever to come over and talk to you afterwards to sort of explain, to make sure that you understand exactly how this, this particular thing fits into the bigger thing that you obviously do understand quite well. So that's a really unusual kind of relationship so I interact very unusually with people. And I operate, because of the nature of Reuters, I operate globally. So I try and, I know DC quite well. I went into the Reuters office and I talked to the people who, the people you see interviewing Trump in the Oval Office. So on that level, and then I operate in the sort of grubby sort of hinterland of being a still fairly junior acting captain after 10 years. So I have an idea about, which often means understanding how things don't work.
Yeah. And
then I sort of crash around somewhere in the middle. As a journalist and writer, talking to people and then trying to sort of put that understanding together. And I think this year has been particularly interesting on that, because actually so many of the decisions that we think and talk about this year, so Iran, maybe a lot of what's happening in Ukraine, are made by a handful of people at the very top, particularly in Washington. So you have the sort of Trump psychodrama, which is behind everything that I do, but is one of the things I try and do with both my journalism and my long form writing, and for that matter, any other conversations I have or operational work I do, is take a step back and go, well, okay, what is going on beyond the Trump psychodrama? And the answer is an unbelievably large amount. I think one of the things that we struggle with in the current environment is that we get very obsessed by, what's going on with Donald Trump and Keir Starmer and Andy Burnham and so forth. And that's really interesting, but there are huge shifts taking place at the moment in terms of tech, geopolitics, the way companies and countries interact with each other, and understanding the crunch points for those. And I mean, I exist in this slightly awkward situation where I would say I barely scratched the surface. And yet, I'm also aware that I'm probably about as well briefed as anyone outside the sort of highly classified space. And I'm also very good at, one of the things I think I always understood, but I certainly understood at the time in government, is that all the highly classified space really gives you is the same as the rest of the world gives you, which is lots and lots of snippets. As to whether I, certainly for the, you won't find any highly classified snippets in my books, and I haven't had access to that most of my life, but I've had for occasional periods. It's just more stuff that you pick up, and it's also stuff that may or may not be true. Yeah. So, I'm quite good at sort of devouring huge swathes of social media and everything else, and working out what's going on. And I think this year the world has become more violent. Notably, if you compare epic fury to the war, to Trump's campaign against Iran or Yemen the previous year, we're just talking about quite a lot more use of weaponry, a lot more use of AI. Essentially, they used a thing called Project Maven to find them 13,000 targets. They hit all those targets. They then discovered Iran wasn't on its knees in the way they hoped they'd be. That tells us quite a lot about how AI will streamline your desire to get to do what you're going to do anyway. So, I mean, essentially what AI has done in that case is it immediately burns out all your computing systems because it will use the maximum computing power available. It's very different to what a human will do, right? If I put a human in a box and throw problems at them, they'll burn out. They'll use all their brain power on it. AI doesn't understand time, which means it doesn't understand resource, which means that it gives you lots of stuff to throw your resource at, and then you don't have any more resource, which is essentially what happened to the Americans and long-range missiles and everything else. And you also see this really worrying escalation into what I'm beginning to think of as a global war on infrastructure war, which is very moderated. So in the Gulf, what you saw was the Americans strike Iran, and then Iran start to strike essential infrastructure in the Gulf. And then you saw the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, pull the plug on that campaign because they were very worried about losing their power plants, their data centers, and even more important, their desalination plants. So the stuff that delivers the water that keeps the Gulf states going. Similarly, in Europe, we've seen the Russians and the Ukrainians really take the gloves off when it comes to infrastructure fights. But what's even more important and has crept up on us slowly, and I think is now starting to alarm people, we're recording this in July of 2026, so the midpoint of the year, is that Ukraine is inflicting massive damage on Russia's essential infrastructure, and it is doing so with Western support and intelligence and missiles. And the hope is that will make Vladimir Putin sue for peace, although even that is dangerous, because if he agrees a peace deal, he'll immediately rearm very quickly, because he will stop using up all his weapons. That will mean he'll immediately become very heavily armed in a matter of frankly, months.
Yeah.
But there is also the prospect that Putin might not choose that off-ramp and might escalate in different directions. And I think we're in a really interesting moment at the moment, because I was at the Chatham House conference last week, and Alistair Cairns, former Royal Marine Full Colonel, former Minister of the Armed Forces, was saying his views was this was the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't quite agree, because I think there was a period in the early 80s that was phenomenally dangerous, just sort of before Gorbachev came to power in the Kremlin, and that was more dangerous because any war would escalate to a full nuclear exchange in a matter of weeks. On the other hand, it was also less dangerous because any war would escalate to a full nuclear exchange in a matter of weeks, if you see where I'm coming from. There's no way in the early 80s that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan would have started blowing up oil refineries in downtown Moscow or St. Petersburg. I mean, that would have ended the world in about 45 seconds. We're now doing that slowly. And so while I think it's relatively unlikely that we end up in a fast nuclear exchange, certainly not possible, we're now at this weird stage where everyone in Whitehall is sort of going, well, there's probably about a 15% chance that a European war will break out this summer because the Russians backlash against something, but also it probably won't. So we'll sort of, and then a classic British role is it, we might as well therefore go on holiday and see what happens and come back in the autumn and either deal with the largest war since 1945 or not. And the most likely is not this year. There's this great Ernest Hemingway quote, which I put in my book, not this August or next. That is yet too soon, but the summer after that, they fight, and then what happens to you? A bit more complicated now because they are fighting.
Yeah.
I mean, they were already fighting in Spain when Hemingway wrote that. But they are fighting and they're escalating. So we're seeing an escalating kinetic confrontation in the Gulf. We're seeing an escalating kinetic confrontation in Russia, Ukraine, in which the United States and Europe are active supporters of Ukraine. They're allowed to be under international law. You're allowed to help a country defend itself without getting involved. But it's unquestionably escalatory. And in the Far East, we are seeing a also the hybrid confrontation is very based on infrastructure, right? Attacking undersea cables, holding at risk power stations, that kind of thing. And in the Far East, that confrontation is not yet kinetic, but it's still pretty punchy.
Yeah.
That conversation and the tone of it. And I think one of the ways in which I'm quite unusual is that I have a reasonable working understanding of money, technology, narrative, and kinetic force. If you look at the comments you're getting in some of the Chinese media about Japan. So Japan has got very nervous. The US is going to withdraw from the region, not immediately, but over time. Japan is rearming, and the Chinese, particularly the Chinese military newspapers, are demonizing Japan in a way they always have, but now has a real edge to it. I mean, so the Japanese have started stepping up their rare earth recycling, and Chinese people are like, these guys are recycling air conditioners to turn them into missiles. I mean, that is sort of what is happening.
Yeah.
And likewise, the PLA newspaper will say, Japan has enough enriched uranium to build 4,000 nuclear weapons, which would give them the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. I suspect that's an overstatement. I find it very hard to believe that Japan has quietly amassed more sort of nuclear material than Russia, which has been doing it for 80 years. But I don't know that for a fact. It's certainly not impossible. And there is no doubt that certainly South Korea is talking about developing a nuclear weapon more publicly. That conversation is taking place behind closed doors in Japan, and even places like it's taking place in Poland, and a whole bunch of I'm sure Volodymyr Zelensky and the government of Australia and a bunch of others keep on sort of thinking about it and deciding not maybe do anything that much yet. So I think there's lots of sound and fury this year, but actually even more significantly, I would say there's lots going on behind the scenes, and we risk missing it for the sound and fury.
100%. And I could listen to this all day, as I'm sure the listeners, other listeners could, but I'm really interested in, so you're sort of starting to take us into what the next world war might look like, which is kind of equal parts sort of thrilling and disconcerting. So if we were to bring it back to UK national resilience, what's your view on how this is playing out in the UK psyche? So, we've got the UK Resilience Committee looking at all sorts of things from sort of Martin's Law through to what does the next world war look like? We've got a live sort of realpolitik discussion around UK defence spending happening in Third Dimension. What's this feeling like, do you think, for sort of UK businesses, the average large organization, and maybe infrastructure leaders? Like, how do you see this playing out in the UK from a national resilience standpoint over the next 6 to 12 months?
So there's two things that are worth stressing first, and then you get to the UK weeds. So the first is that there are two obvious routes forward for the world that aren't great. And they're not necessarily as mutually exclusive as I'm about to make them sound. The first is that things go over the edge and we have what you might refer to as a proper war. And that war restructures the world as seriously as what in the last century we've referred to as the Great War did, and then the Second World War. And those wars have a sort of, have almost a Trojan element to them. The Trojan War was sort of in myth was the first great war of the world, designed to sort of basically say, we're now in this era of punchy, complex geopolitics that's never going to stop. So it is possible that we will have a war, the great war of the 21st century, and that will resemble sort of bits of every war we've ever had, if you see what I mean, in the sense that, and also the one that we didn't, which is the Cold War. So there's that it's possible that we might have a war that goes on for 5 years and changes the fate of every man, woman, and child on the planet with the colossal sacrifice, leaps forward in technology, all the kind of stuff that we associate with that. And that war might or may not end with nuclear Armageddon that puts us back in the Stone Age. I think it's increasingly plausible it might not end that way, and that's one of the reasons why the war becomes more plausible. I still think we will avoid that, but it's somewhere, I was talking about sort of about a 1/3 possibility. In the 2/3 possibility, we don't have that war, but what we also don't have is something that, so I think we have something that is not that war, but is also the end cut, is not the long peace that we've been used to. So, if you think about the long peace being maybe the Cold War plus the 90s, plus the 2010s, plus the 2000s, plus the 2010s, I think it's fairly clear that the long peace, and this again I think comes back to me in that ops room at the beginning of COVID, right? Thinking, right, this might be a systemic shift. And I think with hindsight it was. So the long peace is over, and you're in what I'm sort of characterizing as a battle for the world that is not a war. So, which is what I'm hoping the next book is going to be about. And that is a global confrontation between competing and within different power blocks. So you might be America's closest ally, but competing with them on AI, and other things. You might be all kinds of things going on, incredibly complicated. If you look at the geopolitics of each country, it becomes very transactional, very complicated. UAE is a good example. Saudi is a good example. All of those countries sit down, they look at China, they look at Russia, they look at everything else. They are sort of making decisions and non-decisions in that. The UK, I think, is doing that, but I think it's doing it both uniquely well and uniquely badly. And we're only able to do it uniquely badly because we do the other bit of it uniquely well, if that makes sense. So, and I think part of that is because there is genuinely another narrative and a way of looking at the world, which is that the network built by the British Empire never ended, and that Britain sort of sits at the heart of it. And on some levels, that is obviously true. So I've just been reading London Falling, the book about a guy. It's set in the sort of London world of oligarchs and everything else. It's about the death of a 19-year-old London Jewish kid who got sucked into this and was sort of living his own fantasy life, surrounded by oligarchs. For whom it was not a fantasy life, so he was claiming to be the son of a Russian oligarch, and he obviously got himself incredibly deep into that incredibly messy world. Now, London is the center of that world. Britain isn't, if you see where I'm coming from, and the British government isn't. So there is an argument that says that Britain is sort of turning into this sort of neutral Singapore or Switzerland, and therefore can get away without engaging with all these issues. So, there's also, we have some unique defense situations, not least our situationship with the United States, that are complicated. So, for example, there is an argument that says that actually, if you're looking at the defence of the United Kingdom, you should completely ignore what the UK does. What you should actually be looking at is the US defence package for Lakenheath, Mildenhall, and Fairford, and Faslane, all of which are strategic US bases, and all of which they are investing in, certainly in terms of the air bases, quite considerably, because those bases are far enough back. So I think there is a world, and I'm absolutely certain the Pentagon has noticed this, where Europe escalates to a Europe-wide version of the Ukraine war.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is the case, then Britain becomes sort of airstrip one, to quote George Orwell. It's far enough back, it might be defensible, and the Americans may or may not stick around. None of that seems to be even vaguely figured into the UK strategic defence thinking, or how councils engage with stuff. I think we need to have more of a conversation about what the actual threats are.
Yeah.
So Britain may come under attack from drones and missiles, and sea drones that can cut off our essential supply chain, which is not that different to the threat we have faced in the past, right? I mean, Britain is quite defensible, but you can bomb it and you can throttle it. We know this because people have done both in the past and probably will again. The networks on which we depend, fuel, food, and the sort of cyber backbone, are all quite resilient, but quite attackable. Our communities have certain advantages. We're still a very village and town-based country. So, to put it in context, Australia has 2 cities that are larger than any British city aside from London. In fact, it probably has more than that, because our second largest city is Birmingham, with 1.5 million people. And by most measurements, almost all Australian cities you've ever heard of are bigger than that, with the exception of Darwin, which is 150,000 people. So both Perth and Adelaide, which is in southern Australia, that's Western and Southern Australia, are bigger cities than, and so those cities have to be defended if you're Australia. And Britain doesn't look like that at all. Most people live in towns. We have one metropolis that dominates everything. But I do think that we probably need to do more in terms of thinking about, we grow most of our own food, brilliant, hurrah for that. But how would we distribute it if we didn't have enough petrol? One of the transitions most countries are on is the transition from hydrocarbons to electric. So, for example, the head of the Swedish army was saying, Sweden has made the decision that to defend your own terrain, electricity is brilliant, because you can literally destroy the infrastructure as someone else comes in, and you have huge amounts of power on your turf. So they've looked at the battle in Ukraine and gone, right, well, if everything in Ukraine had run on batteries in 2022, which wasn't possible in 2022, and we had lots of power cables going forward, the Ukrainians could have strategically blown up those power cables to make it a lot, and the Russians would have might have been able to advance on their own electricity sort of grid in the same way that countries do advance on railways. I don't think the UK is thinking seriously about power generation in that kind of strategic way, partly because we don't have a threat of invasion. And I think the important thing to remember about Britain is that it has been under realistic threat. It has realized it has been under realistic threat of invasion for about 4 years in Queen Elizabeth I's reign, about the same period of time in the sort of rise of Napoleon before the defeat of the French fleet at Trafalgar, for a period that at its most was about 3.5, 4 years in the 1930s and 40s, but actually really is probably only from about May 1940 to December 1941, and barely even that. Once Hitler invades the Soviet Union in July of 41, that threat really vanishes. And it is quite difficult to persuade a country that has only been under threat of invasion for possibly less than a decade in the last half millennia, even if we mythologize about it the entire bloody time. We have surprising little historical conversation that is not about that 10-year period.
Yeah.
But I mean, almost all our sitcoms are even set in it. Think of it, sort of Shakespeare. We're completely bonkersly obsessed by these things. most British podcasts spend an alarming amount of time focused on the Napoleonic Wars, the Elizabethan era, and the 1940s. But that does not give you a country that is big on decisions. I mean, I think I was talking to a bunch of people about this. And we don't really have, I mean, John Bew, who wrote the last 4 strategic defence reviews, was just on another podcast. He was saying it's time to get our house in order. It's kind of like, only in Britain would the man who wrote the last 4 strategic defence reviews set himself up as the last one, which only just came out, to suggest that we now need radical change, none of which is recommended in the last 4 strategic defence reviews, which he wrote.
It's on us. It's on our generation, as ever. What also strikes me about what you said is kind of like the kind of fundamentally to a military mindset, like how boring the actual resilience area is. So like we're not having enough conversations in strategy around G4 to G9. It's a lot of our strategy is based on the front end of large sort of, if you like, maneuver capabilities even now. And yet you're right, there's this kind of strategic dilemma of, have we missed the opportunity, the great opportunity?
I mean, I've developed a theory on this, which is that I think, and I am as guilty of this as anybody, and arguably should be a poster child for the risk of thinking this way for everyone in my generation or anyone else's, which is that, not unlike Doctor Who, which I think is quite a good way of distilling this, Britain doesn't have British people think that they should have adventures rather than other things. And if you look at the way the British military thinks, it's very adventure based.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in fact, our entire orders process, I mean, Sophie Watts was talking about this last week, but actually to review, it basically drills down into here is a situation. It has been decided that something must be done. Please design something. And then the bit we never talk about, but actually, and please design something in a way which would appeal to the adventurous nature of about a 12-year-old. So because what you actually then, so what we are going to do is we're going to design a special forces operation to steal Hitler's radar. Brilliant. That's very exciting. We are going to send an aircraft carrier to the high north. We're going to send a forward reconnaissance unit to Mali. And I think what that really means, and I've spent years pondering this, but I'm glad, is that you completely forget that this is actually about real people's lives. So you are, let's take Mali as an example. So, Britain decided to send a lightly armored reconnaissance squadron to Mali. I'm very excited about it. And engaged with it without a moment's engagement of what might actually be best for the long-term interests of the people of the Sahel. I mean, I'm not saying we would have done a better job, but it was very much and that's not necessarily stupid, because the British task was find something you could do in a UN formation with a British force of this size. But I think we're addicted to that kind of thinking. And if you look at what has happened in NATO, other countries are dealing with the UK with what I would describe as a fantastic degree of strategic politeness. And if you actually look at where Britain has been eased to in NATO, so we were the framework nation for the defence of Estonia from 2016 onwards, which was a deal signed off by Michael Fallon as Defence Secretary about 2 days after Brexit. Very, very sensible strategic move, incidentally. Britain's pulling out of Europe, which is why we're going to put a battle group in the most exposed Eastern European nation. Now, that is strategic judgment and sense. We immediately got very bored of it. So the first group that went out there, and in fact, I think you had some visibility of this, right? Everyone was quite excited. And they all got quite excited out there. And then the Russians didn't invade, which was, from the entirely selfish perspective of the battle groups rotating through Estonia, slightly disappointing. And even more disappointingly, the Estonians did not allow the British to take over everything in the way that the British have been able to do in Helmand. What has happened since is that we've been eased completely out of strategic leadership in the Baltic. So in the last 3 months, a German-Dutch Corps HQ has been set up to coordinate the defense of Latvia and Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. Well, and the Germans also control what will be the force in Lithuania. and the Poles and Lithuanians have their own structures. So what you're seeing is the people who live there, the Balts plus the Poles plus the Germans, actually designing a backbone to defend NATO's eastern flank. The UK still has its detachment in Estonia, but it has been nudged to its offer to NATO to be a reserve corps, so the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, and sort of aircraft carriers and other stuff, and some defense of the high north where missiles will fire into Russia and hold the Murmansk at risk, and command of the NATO headquarters in the North Atlantic, which will be commanded, revealingly enough, most likely primarily by Royal Marine generals, which tells you that the US Navy will run any long-term battle for the Atlantic if it's about getting stuff across, and the Brits will be encouraged to climb mountains and do daring do in Norway. So they've basically, incredibly politely and without telling us that they've noticed, taken us to a bunch of stuff that would be really useful if it came off, but is not systemic. So, and probably will not change anything, if something. So, yes, the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps will come over the hill in the event of a major war in Europe. But the kind of major war we're talking about, the entire German population will be being conscripted at this point.
Yeah. This is where I kind of start to think about the conversation we've had around strategic wargaming and actually how it's done well. And I'd kind of use, I think probably you would, the Rand war games is a good sort of systemic sort of wargaming system. I mean, it strikes me that we're just not doing enough of this strategic sort of chance analysis and dilemma analysis in the UK setting. Would you say that's fair?
I don't think it really. I mean, I think the I think the whole nature of wargaming is interesting. So if you look at how the US does wargame, they will wargame a massive confrontation, and then they will attempt to, and that wargame will end with the US facing down someone else with their strategic atomic arsenals, and they will work out what happens if it goes over the edge. But the entire point is to make sure it doesn't get that far.
Is to win. Yeah.
It's not to win in the case of the US. And Elbridge Colby is really clear about this in his most recent speech. If you want to understand how America approaches the world, Elbridge Colby, number 3 at the Pentagon, gave a speech to the US Naval War College in May. And he basically said, we can't defeat our enemies because they'll nuke us. So we can't march into Beijing or Moscow. That's never going to happen. And suggesting that it might would be dangerous. We will try and deter by denial. In other words, we'll work with our allies to make sure that anyone who tries to change the status quo by taking Taiwan or Estonia gets a bloody nose, or at least think they might. But beyond that, we eventually have to find a way to live in this planet without destroying it. And that is the US challenge. That is not the European challenge. The European challenge is our pattern of escalation is that we believe that there are enough nuclear weapons in Europe, US, British, French, whatever else we could build on a rainy day to hopefully deter Russia from going into a massive strategic exchange with us. Which means that our pattern of escalation just has to mean that we both keep on escalating until Russia runs out of troops and industrial strength. And that is the European, this war will never happen, because if it does, we have enough human firepower and industrial firepower to be able to push the Russians back over time, and probably sweep them from their key ports in the Arctic, the Baltic, and the Black Sea. So we could take or destroy Murmansk, Kaliningrad, St. Petersburg, and Sevastopol. Which would end Russia as a great power. Even if, and we would do that by fighting a repeat of the Western Front or the current front line in Ukraine for as long as it takes, if the Russians come. If the Russians do not come, and they shouldn't, because they're not stupid enough to take on a 300 million person continent, then it won't happen. And that, I think, is what I mean about British national level strategy now barely matters in the big picture. Because actually, if you look at, Mehdi Hassan was on a podcast, so very not very left wing, but left of centre, left of Alistair Campbell. He was on the rest of politics. Really, really big critic of Donald Trump, but more optimistic about the US, where he now lives, than the UK. And one of the reasons is because it's a continent and a country. So basically is Russia, so basically is China, so basically is India, so basically is Australia.
Yeah.
So basically is Europe. We, on the other hand, are a larger version of the Republic of Ireland. And that puts us in a very different position. Now, it still means there are a bunch of choices for us. And through being, a major legal superpower and insurance superpower, but I don't think we sit down an intelligence superpower, or are we really? I mean, I think possibly quite a lot of that is just because the Americans share stuff with us. So I think actually, I think the problem since the war, and I haven't written a history of NATO, is that we are fantastically insecure. So, for example, the British government is heavily dependent on the US for intelligence. This is not, everyone knows this. I don't think it has to be, but no one in power believes me. Does that mean? I think I could come up with some reasonable plans on the back of a fag packet that would allow Britain to actually work within its limits and do stuff while still taking advantage of those things.
Well, that kind of brings me on to the kind of, because we're coming to the close now, and I think the sort of lesson from the future is to have the right people around the table to identify the next epoch of warfare, of which you're probably one of most of those tables. So I guess just
I don't think I am. I think I am. This is another thought that I've had quite a lot. There is a journalistic approach to life, which I have had before I became a journalist, which is to look at everything and sort of admire the problem and point out inconvenient truths. In fact, the duty is almost to point out inconvenient truths. This is not regarded as helpful in most bigger systems. And I'm very good at inconvenient truths and inconvenient possibilities. That doesn't get me invited to a lot of rooms.
So I guess the question then corresponding to that, because I think for many of our viewers watching this, that I think that the archetype would be someone who's interested, like I was, in having a hybrid career that brings together, beyond my time in green, if you like, brings together my military sort of thinking, my strategic mind, and my international perspective. What would your kind of advice be to someone who's thinking, how can I be more Peter Apps? How should they craft a life that brings all of those together outside of the military?
Oh God, I thought you were asking. I thought the question was how to be a bit less Peter Apps. So the first and obvious lesson is consider being a bit less than Peter Apps, because being Peter Apps allows you to race around the world in your early 20s and then ends up being paralyzed for life. So in other words, your kind of embrace of the now and what Barack Obama called the fierce urgency of now, which is why he ran when he did. And I believe that very much about the stories I was covering in Sri Lanka, for example. I would say, so I'd say the first trick is look at the fierce urgency of now and consider moderating it with the slightly more moderate energy of maybe just not this time, right? Or maybe just not, it's the fierce urgency of now versus the strategic indecision of maybe later. But I think my irritations in life can't stem from that. Having said that, you don't know what things look like, right? So I am also, the flip side of that is that I might have ended up paralyzed anyway, and I'm very glad that I did all that sort of fierce urgency of now stuff in my early 20s. And also, and this I suppose is the irony of it, had I not done those things, I would have struggled to do the stuff I've done afterwards.
Yeah.
So for example, a degree of my credibility and capability, huge, and certainly my capability, less of my credibility maybe than it should be, is within the military sort of conflict-related circles. I have been to war and I have walked around not just battlefields, but war zones, and they're different. Battlefields are where battles are taking place. War zones are where the wider conflict is being raged through things like extrajudicial killings.
Yeah.
So, for example, one of the things that I squared with morally when I came back, because I thought I'd be quite good at it, I came back in at the same time as the sort of Daesh war was going on, the war with ISIS. And I decided that I was certainly prepared to sit in a classified room and work out which people might need to be killed in certain environments to achieve certain outcomes.
Yeah.
Because I have wiped the blood off my boots of watching that happen on a village by village basis. And while I don't talk about it a lot, I really have a pretty good understanding of how you use lethal force and torture and the threat of torture to achieve ends. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should, and some of those are you.
But you understand it.
I definitely know how bad people do it.
Yeah.
And I have my own thoughts about how the people fighting those bad people might respond. Does that mean? And there are a variety of tools one can use, from sort of, highlighting things and showing them to, what the Americans refer to as warheads on foreheads.
Yeah.
If I had not spent a year in Sri Lanka doing that kind of stuff, exactly the kind of trip that I got, broke my neck on, I wouldn't understand it. I think there's a strong argument that says the less that you see of that side of life, the better. And you should all raise your children to know that they don't want to get into that kind of world. I think the bits I've done well, what I've done, if there's a good side to my story, rather than just don't get paralyzed at the age of 25 because it makes life a bit more complicated, it is that I have a pretty good ability to physically sort of get up, drag myself down the line and carry on.
Yeah.
So with a degree of curiosity and drive and whatever, that makes me interesting, definitely valuable periodically. I think it's probably the best way I would put it, or at least of value. And I think, but I think I have not, partly because I'm locked in a room so long.
Yeah.
If the difference between me and people who've had conventionally successful careers at a high level is that they are much better than me at not saying things, not engaging with things, and my criticism of them, sometimes to a varying degree, is that can then quickly become not noticing things.
Yeah.
And indeed, and carrying on, and that brings its own regret. I mean, so I think the other extreme, I wouldn't say who it was, but he was a very senior British official who had spent time in both the Foreign Office and elsewhere. So unquestionably incredibly successful. But I saw him speak at a private event, and he said that what he realized when he'd been running particularly one of the great departments of state, what he had really achieved was to make the system work better by its own rules for the time he ran it, and that had not fixed the overarching problem. I don't think I have. No, that's not entirely true. I do sometimes make systems work better, but I am often. No, I think I can make systems work better, but I think the nature of me means people are only prepared to risk giving me the keys to those systems in extremis post-injury.
When it happens.
And that's what I got wrong.
Yeah. Well, I'll see you in the next one then, because I think there's similar things happen with me. Right. We must wrap. I could talk about this for hours. I'm sure everyone's like, you're going to get lots of reach outs from this, because people will be absolutely fascinated by your perspective on not just the next World War, but this sort of concept of the battle for, if you like, hearts and minds. And
well, no, I think speaking of that, so I think what is currently underway is a battle between absolutely everyone for absolutely everything. I mean, it's not just heart and minds, it's resource, it's lithium, it's space, it's the electromagnetic spectrum, it's cyber, it's social and romantic opportunity, and career opportunity, and views, and clicks, and coal. It's like, it's literally housing. It's literally everything. And I think in a hyper contested world where every individual is fighting against Elon Musk's and nations, and I think the trick, which I haven't thought myself through properly, but I think one of the things I'm hoping to understand better through the book is how you prepare people to survive and thrive in that environment. Because basically you take my nieces are just come up to 12. How do you take a 12-year-old and turn her into the woman who can survive and thrive and enjoy the world of, so what's 2032? Well, she turns 18 or give or take, where she and everything she's got don't need to fight everything else, but she needs to find a way to go through that incredibly complex dynamic while getting what she wants from life, whatever that turns out to be. And I think that is the new exam question, and working out how you think about that, I think, is the challenge.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, I'm conscious of time, Peter. I would love to carry on, but let's close here. Thank you so much for joining us on Command to Commerce. For those who are watching, I think lots to think on, whether it's on sort of UK national resilience, the wider strategic picture for the next epoch, the next sort of 10 to 50 years. I'm sure a lot of people will be looking out for your next book, Peter.
One last point on that. I think, again, we haven't talked about it but I think, it's about local resilience, right? Each fire brigade needs to be able to grow and needs to be able to deploy 10 times as many people on the off chance we're being struck by drones. You need the surge capability, which means you need ordinary people to be able to do more serious stuff, whether that is far from help medicine or running supplies or defending their communities or fighting fires. We need to be building that resiliency because we don't know what the future looks like. But a shock to the system would be catastrophic. And we are not building enough societal resilience at that town level, because the same as it always has been, you basically need the people, the good people in a town to come together if the lights go out and say, here are our capabilities to secure the food supplies, try and get in communication with the next town, try and find out what the hell the national government is doing. And we didn't bother doing that in the Cold War because everyone was going to be too dead and it was all going to be irradiated. Now there's probably a survivable version of that.
100%.
The other thing I would leave people with, again, is that it's about being prepared for your worst ever day. That may all happen at once, but more likely won't. I was quite prepared to wake up, paralyzed from the shoulders down. I was able to get myself home alive. There is a structural societal version of that, and what we get wrong, and I have a disagreement. Say Dan Jarvis, current Secretary of State for Defence. His approach when I say, what we tell people who are worried, the military is all in on trying to fix this. Kind of like, well, that's great, but unfortunately, there's only 100,000 of you, so that's not really very useful. The nation has to be prepared to get all in, and we're not capable of have those discussions.
I think that's bang on. So resilience is a mindset, both sort of strategically and individually. Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. And see you soon. And thanks to everyone. And reminder to everyone we're sort of recording something generally weekly at the moment. So watch out for the next chapter of Command to Commerce. We'll be straying into this sort of murky world of information security and the world of the CISO next. So for those of you interested in that side of things, that will be the next one. Thank you so much, Peter. Speak soon, and great to see you.
Absolute pleasure. Press escape.